Welcome to Ren Faire History, presented by the Digital Ren Fair. I'm Jonathan Crocker. I perform with the Wild Men at the Arizona Renaissance Festival as Dr. Cranius Lunch, and as Jake the Wild Men with Theater in the Ground at the Ohio Renaissance Festival. And I have been performing at Renaissance festivals since 1982. And today, I am joined by the lovely and talented Misti Bernard.
Hi, friends. I'm Misti Bernard. I have been on the road since 1990, full-time, and performing since 1993. You would know me from the Bay Area Renaissance Festival, from the Florida Renaissance Festival, Bristol. I've performed at Sterling. I've performed at Colorado. I am also a jewelry designer, and I own a company called Seasong Design. So I am both crafter and performer on the road.
And that's been one of the aspects of, of these times, the pandemic and just getting older, we're falling away, I'm very conscious of entering that generation where there are fewer and fewer of us all the time. And there are great stories and great personalities among us who deserve their voice.
Absolutely.
And perspective. So yeah, I'm hoping we can reach out to a number of people as part of this process too. Absolutely.
Along those lines, it was such a wild moment when Phyllis Patterson died.
Right.
We all that information all filtered onto the circuit. And there were so many vivid memories. Phyllis Patterson, just for anybody who might not know, was the founder of the Southern California Renaissance Pleasure Fair back in the 60s. That's my home show. So I actually knew Phyllis in a very peripheral manner. I was just a little geeky kid going, oh my God, it's Phyllis Patterson, the founder of us, the mother of us all, and she was so iconic. And the whole process of being in that moment, in that time. Now, I obviously wasn't there in the 60s. My first year at Southern Cal would have been in 1989 as a visitor, spring of 1990 as a participant. So, it had 20 years of development before I even showed up on the scene. But there was still this a very difficult, like you hear some of the longtime Rennies talking about the magic of the early days of the festival. On the one hand, it sounds like old crotchety people, back when I was a kid, that whole thing. And on the other hand, there was this hard to verbalize emotional heart space that was so profound in that time that I've experienced. It's not like, I was young then and I could feel those feels. It was more like I've definitely felt those feels as an adult. And back then, that time and space was just genuinely magic.
Yeah, that's interesting because my first encounter with the Renaissance Festival was a little earlier than that, but I auditioned and got a role at the Sterling Renaissance Festival, or at that time the Sterling Pleasure Fair and Summer Marketplace, which was very much an attempt to emulate and to capture and transport what was going on in California, upstate New York.
Sure.
The founder of that festival, was a history professor in Southern California who experienced the magic, in the 60s and 70s, had some property outside of Oswego, New York, in the family. And so his dream upon retirement was to recreate that magic. And it's interesting because, people talk about the magic, it's that experience of entering that space where so much intention had been layered on over years and years of creating a place. I mean, the actual slogan of the Sterling Renaissance Fair at that time was a beautiful place for beautiful people to do beautiful things.
Well, that's the best slogan I've ever heard. Oh my God.
I mean, and it was a little, as a cynical college student, it was a little saccharine for my taste. Going in, I thought, oh yeah, right. But then it really is a beautiful place, and it was a place for people to let their beauty shine and their creativity. This place for creative exploration that was unlike anything I'd ever even considered as a possibility. And when you enter into that space, and it's, especially when you're young and impressionable, it is magic. It's powerful. And that is, I think, something of the legacy that I'm interested in trying or in conveying and also supporting, because that still exists. Certainly there's been a lot of evolution in what Renaissance fairs are and how they work as a business, even where they fit into the cultural map of the country. But there's still this legacy of creative enterprise and a spirit of play that is woven throughout this whole heritage and all of the fairs. That is a really important part of American culture. And it's when I was 21 and first auditioned for a fair, I'd never heard of a Renaissance festival until this friend of mine suggested that it might be an interesting thing for me. I don't know how many 21-year-old college students in America have never heard of a Renaissance festival at this point. They're, it's much more an established part of the cultural landscape.
Absolutely. Coming into the current times, and that, like, speaking of that magic, I actually performed at the West Virginia Renaissance Festival in 2020, this year. It was magic. It was magic, and it was it's this little teeny wee festival started by Tazo, the jouster, and then Dawn of New Pterodactyl Leather.
Right.
And so a 30-year performer and a 30-year crafter got together and decided to recreate something amazing. And it was genuinely magic. And what was, I think, on the one hand, it was a very sparse little show because, so many cancellations, nobody knew what to expect. A lot of people were like, oh, it's sort of a small show. I'm not going to drive all the way out there, on the off chance that people will show up. So that definitely had that aspect of it where it was very tiny and compressed. On the other hand, it's set on a working farm, a working horse farm,
Right.
So the festival didn't open until 11 in the morning was canon, because they had to do all their morning farm chores. But so consequently, there's chickens wandering around. there's goats, the goats were penned on the weekend, but goats trotting around, during the week. And it was this absolutely beautiful, just heart space that was so creative and so fresh. It was, people were approaching it freshly. And if there was a festival that I've been to recently, that actually still made me say, oh, I can hearken back on that emotional state and feel that magic. It was there. It was just really neat, and there were a couple of other quite a few other old timer. I don't like to think of myself as an old timer. Veteran Renaissance Festival performers.
Yes. Careful how you label us here.
Sure. I know, right? And we were all just like, are you feeling that? Are you feeling that? Because I'm feeling that, and we were all really giggly about it. It was super cool.
That's great. That's great. Yeah.
It was great. It was great.
Yeah, I think there is something about scale that, when a festival is young and usually smaller, there are different sizes of crowds have and of participation, have different potential. And under a certain size, when a crowd is under a few thousand people, there's a real difference in intimacy and contact. People, we used to talk about this at Sterling when in the early years, about when the magic happened, when at some point during the day there would be a wave that would pass over the festival almost every day, every festival day, and there was a lot of talk about did you feel that? What was that exactly? And it was the feel. We kind of drew in or circled around the idea that it was the wave when resistance dissolved. People coming into the festival not really sure what they were getting into, and who are these people who are trying to pretend to be somebody else and talking to me funny, and I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this, and no, I'm not your Uncle Bob, and all of those little bits of resistance. And at some point, because of the size of the crowd and the amount of recontact that characters could have, you could develop relationships with everybody in the crowd, and those continuous reaffirming of the premise of the festival reality finally would break through, and people would say, "Oh, this is a play space. I don't have to, bring my rules about what's right and what's real. And I can let go and give in to whatever this is, which seems to be really fun and joyful and celebratory, and simply release into that." And once that sort of 100th monkey effect takes place, there really is this sense of a magical transformation. And,
like the suspension of disbelief hits a critical mass.
Yeah, exactly.
And suddenly we're all there on the same page. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to know.
Yeah, no, and something like that, I think, sort of carries forth in the general heritage of larger festivals, where people come, once a festival is really established and you have a large body of people who have been coming for years, then they come with all of their expectations about what the festival day is going to be like. And that gives that whole transformation sort of a jumpstart.
It's also steeped in history and lore, is really what it is. It's the Southern California Renaissance Pleasure Fair, the Renaissance Pleasure Fair, as it was known, was the first festival. It was developed from the very seeds of an idea of a woman named Phyllis Patterson. She was this cool lady. I only had a couple of interactions with her over the early years of the festival. I did that show from 1990 through about 94, 5, 6, something like that, early 90s. And had scattered interactions with her, but she was always very sort of mythic and down home at the same time, she was a very interesting character. Every year, the Renaissance Pleasure Fair had used to, I've not been since it's under the current management, but every year it used to have just a little living history diorama sort of thing that you could walk through with photos of the early days and, little write-ups and documents defining them. And one of the things that I really loved about walking through that is that the visual of that in the earliest of days, like the photographs that they would have, from the first year. And it was so a product of the 60s. It was a product of the Vietnam War era. It was a product of, like there were photographs of young women in full, in Renaissance, like peasant gear, but with berets and their fists upraised in front of signs that say no to catapult testing, and it was bringing the idea of the ideas that they were dealing with as Vietnam War era performers and participants into the medieval times. And what would it was both 60s era and simultaneously gloriously Monty Python. It was just delicious, and so those are some of the things that I most remember about that living history tour that they would do. And where I came into it in the 80s was the late 80s, it was so codified. I mean, I remember my friend Kat, who was the person who first started me doing festival, Kat Ferren. You had to go before a panel, or a costume director that would go over your costuming piece by piece and tell you if it was approved. And she had her costuming. She had one overdress that had these rainbow threads around, like it was full cotton, like cotton linen, but it had just this really light rainbow surging at the edges. And she was forbidden to wear it because that would never happen in the Renaissance. And, and it was just like, we were all like, we're not getting paid. We're just here, man. Really? So that was one of those hilarious things. But also the dialect was so, like, in those early years, I would read The Prince and the Pauper every year before festival to get myself into dialect. And there was this point where, so my friend Kat and I, the aforementioned Kat, we were both students. And so we were living on campus, and we would ride down together from San Francisco down to Agora and Devore, in those early days of the festival. And so we would be in dialect hard, and it was, people would call you on it, and you were as a performer, as a random, participant, as a crafter, everybody was expected to keep it going because this is what creates the magic, right? And so there was this point where we had walked into like a head shop in San Francisco, right? And we're just kind of looking at things and, whatever. But we're in full dialect and just chitting and not even aware of it. It was like this totally subconscious sort of thing because we were so immersed at that point. And we're in there for, a couple of minutes chatting back and forth. And this kid behind the counter is looking at us going, where are you people from? And we hadn't even noticed. It was so genuine. We were just like, oh, we were doing oh my God, we were doing the Renaissance Festival, and it was just this intuitive, thick, like the dialect coaching was thick, so that's part of what I remember most from that time is both the fact that it was irritatingly strict and also the fact that that strictness was what genuinely created the full immersion effect, and the depth of the moment for everybody involved.
No, that very much parallels my experience with Sterling in the early 80s. As a cast member, we went 3 weeks early, 3.5 weeks early, and 6 days a week, we were in classes on dialect and manners and history and custom and costume, and as well as the performing techniques of improv and interaction. And so by the time we came out of this, really intense immersion, we were in that same boat very much, hard to turn it off, and really delighting in the in the play space that we were able to create, and the theatricality of it, and that discipline, as you said, it's like one of the, I think, the power of that kind of commitment is that all the performance has such a solid context that there's a whole range of comedy that you can access because of the things you're not allowed to refer to or not allowed to do, and that discipline gives you some freedom in a way to more fully embody the character and the time and the place. And I think that was very much a part of that sense of magic that we conveyed and participated in those, when back when that sense of commitment was much more strong and enforced. There really was. I mean, in my contract, it said, you will not break character from the hour of 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. You are your character and you're committed to that, and you shall not speak as yourself or refer to anything outside of that character reality. And that's hard, but it creates a really great platform upon which to work as an entertainer, and knowing that everybody that you interact with is going to be on the same page. All of the other performers, anybody in costume, will accept and amplify that reality. And so it really did create this amazing play space.
Absolutely. I remember taking passages from this is going to sound so funny, from the King James Bible, and saying it as so for example, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me down to lie. And going through and just taking these King James and working that. How would that be said? I lie down in cold pastures, or what have you. And just working that part of it, or doing recitation from Shakespeare, or doing recitation from The Prince and the Pauper, which was a favorite of mine just as a read. And the fact that it's written so heavily in dialect. But
right.
I think your experience, I can only imagine as an actor whose sole goal, like the dialect, asked me to speak about The Prince and the Pauper, which was a Mark Twain novel. And it tells the story of, it was Mark Twain's first attempt at historical fiction back in the 1880s. And it tells the story of Tom Canty and Prince Edward the Fourth or the Sixth. Let me think. Sixth. Okay, so Prince Edward the Sixth, who were identical twins, but are identical. They were born on the same day. They were identical, interchangeably so. And so Tom Canty comes under the eye of the prince in some way. And it's that classic shift where the peasant is dressed up in the prince's clothes, and the prince gets to go and explore the world as a peasant. And they do a switch, and they do a switch back. The dialectic writing of Twain at that time was so cool. I mean, it's so cool, but it was one of my go-tos because it was so fun. It's such a fun read. I always found Shakespeare, Prince and Pauper was more approachable. And as somebody who had never studied Shakespeare or had any actor training whatsoever, Shakespeare was less approachable to me.
Accessible.
It was less accessible. Correct.
Yeah.
As a little, as a little crafter girl.
That's always been an interesting. That was one of the tensions we talked about, when we were doing our workshops. Is you do need to walk that line between authenticity and accessibility, and that's always been part of the dynamic at festivals. It's like, well, you need to have a certain amount of integrity, or the whole thing falls apart. And I mean integrity in the terms of things holding together and continuity between different aspects of the whole event. But you can't be in the Renaissance because so many frames of reference just wouldn't work. And also, there's all of the more practical aspects of it. Really was a difficult time, and you don't want to reproduce things like the plague and open sewers and all of those delightful aspects of of that era.
Though is that SoCal in those early days, absolutely, especially dialectically, and I think there was such a universal commitment to it that we dragged the participant or the patron in. People were dragged into it forcibly, forced to engage with it.
Sure.
Because there was that, because that's what it was. And genuinely, like craft shops would be fine if they caught you duding or whatever. Oh, absolutely. There were ramifications if you broke accent. And it was, so today I find like REC shows try to do that. Bristol Tuxedo, they try to have more of an insistence on universal accent, universal dialect. But back then, I think maybe it was that, or maybe it was just the craft shop that I was at. I was with Fellowship Foundry back then, and they were utterly committed to the process. We were one of the first booths that you walked into as you came into that shop or into that show. And so there was complete and utter participation in that thing. It
Mhm.
was my experience of the crafterland, and we were, even at the time, we were all told, you are all actors. This is
Sure.
what we all do. You're not, there's no division. This is the way this works, and this is the way this will be successful. And it was sincere. Like, that was
Yeah.
a sincere statement.
Southern California certainly was, the origin. And it's very interesting. You were talking about how it connected with the political realities of the time, and also I think with the artistic and political sensibilities of that region. And it actually started as a benefit. Well, it first started as a project, just a personal project of Phyllis Patterson's, as a living history project for like her high school students. The first sort of big public event was a benefit for Pacifica Radio, which was the public radio station, the radical public radio station in Southern California. According to Well Met, which is history of Renaissance festivals in America, one of the things that was going on at that time is that the sheriff of LA had cracked down on the coffee houses in Los Angeles County. And so all of the sort of the beatnik counterculture folks didn't have a place to gather. And then suddenly there was this festival going on, outside of the city, and the radio station was one of the things that sort of brought them all together, or, communication wise. So it sort of spontaneously became a refuge for these beatnik refugees, basically from LA. And that was one of the things that kind of jump-started the culture of the fairs, is all of the artists and performers and thinkers and poets and people got into this art project that was the Renaissance Festival, or the Renaissance Fair. And craftspeople sort of spontaneously discovered it and think, well, I make pottery, that would work in a Renaissance environment. And that marketplace sort of developed, out of all of that as it grew. And then they expanded to Northern California. And then in the 70s, other entrepreneurs had studied what was going on in Southern California and realized that it might be possible to recreate that in a business fashion. Still, they sort of transplanted that culture of crafts and arts and improvisation and interaction that came out of the Southern California, that 67 Southern California experience. And then there were these little islands that plunked up around the rest of the country, first in Minnesota and then in Texas and Kansas City and Maryland and Sterling, upstate New York, in the late 70s. So there was this kind of propagation of this concept that jumped around the country in the second wave of festivals in the 70s. And then, of course, people went to those festivals. And then there was this third blossoming, in a sense. There's no clear division of those, but it was like a generational thing specifically. But as the concept became more accepted, and as the business model was developed, and other entrepreneurs realized that it could be done in their city, then there was this explosion. And I think by the early 90s, there was a Renaissance festival pretty much around any city that had a professional sports team. That's one of the things that friends of mine and I observed. Is like, there's a correlation there. If there's enough population to support a professional sports team, there's enough population to support a Renaissance festival. So that kind of just became an observed phenomenon.
Hilarious.
And when I had entered the industry in 1982, I had no idea that there was more than one Renaissance festival. I just went to this one in upstate New York, and but as I met other performers and craftspeople, and the started to hear the lore of where the festival came from, I realized, there's a thing going on here, and it's nationwide, and it's growing. I kind of got swept up in it. Was lucky, I guess, getting into the industry in a time when it was growing so dramatically, and there was a real need for entertainment at other festivals. So I was just blessed with this circumstance where people would pay me to create, which is an interesting, I think, dimension of Renaissance festivals as we pretend to do something, we often discover underlying realities about the nature of the thing that we're trying to pretend to be or do. There I was having actual patronage, just like a Renaissance artist might have had, the Duke, the Count, the King, well, whoever it was that ran the festival, and most owners of those times labeled themselves at least one of those things. They would throw me a purse of coin to make them laugh and make their people laugh. And it really was like stepping into this interesting recapitulation of those circumstances that we were trying to pretend to be and do. There's so many different directions to go from there that I kind of found myself in a brain lock.
Well, it's funny because Jonathan and I had this wonderful sort of the seeds of this conversation. Really, we had this chat on Doug Mumau's porch one evening this early this fall. It was so enlightening to have somebody with such a similar yet different experience in those early days. And one of the things that I noticed at the time was that Jonathan, was that when you were discussing your experience, you took this long arc. Like, you were very aware of the long arc in that conversation, and also just now. Whereas I tend to dive in on a particular moment, in the storytelling process and in the way I remember those times. It's not throughout the arc, it's through specific moments. But I was just thinking of that in relation to that conversation that we had, which was just magical, just sitting and kind of being the old dudes on the porch with our glasses of wine and just, I can't remember what, and feeling like I remember the first time I saw you perform.
Mm-hmm.
Very first time, and it was shocking to me because I didn't know what you did. I knew that you were a mudbagger, and I'd seen you in the street for however long, but this would have been at Scarborough, Scarborough in the early to mid 90s. And and I had seen the Crocker character wandering around in the streets. And then I went to your show for the first time. And I remember you watching it and the setup for the story. And somehow it was, you were acting out the character, and then whatever character put mud in the most disgusting place he could imagine, was the narrator saying. And Jonathan's got this clump of mud in his hands, and he looks out with just this whole body realization and just goes, flunk. It was the most ridiculously funny thing, and I had just no idea what to expect of that show. And I remember just in that moment of going, ugh.
I used to respect that man.
It was hilarious. So again, with a tangent into the detailed moment, but yeah, that was just kind of one of those visuals. I think when you know somebody long enough, there's this thing in certain languages, Asian ideogrammic languages, called a key idiom, and it's basically, as was explained to me a million years ago, so I'm probably butchering it, but it's the idea that this one pictogram means this thing, but it has this swirl of alternate meanings and nuances that cluster around it.
Okay.
So when I am speaking with you, it's like you're like the key idiom. And then there are this cluster of nuances and details that float around you, and also inform, the conversation. So I sort of dove into that and went into tangential reality. But so back to you, Jonathan.
Yes. I often wonder just what people think of when they see me, because so much of my life and so much of my interaction and meeting people has been in character, and the characters I've chosen to portray at fairs have been fairly extreme. My first role was the village idiot, and that's really has informed everything else I've done. So being outrageous, being an oddball kook, and pushing the limits of social conformity, has always been a part of what I bring to my performances. Your story reminds me of the woman I ended up marrying had the same experience as you did, where she met me, off stage, and then she was also watching this mud show that she could see from the porch of the shop that she was staying in. And I guess for a couple of weeks, she had no idea that the guy on the stage of the mud show was the same guy that she had been meeting socially in other circumstances. And when the two kind of came together, there was a moment of shock and reassessment. But
I think I had a similar conversation with Angelin at some point as well, Angelin Zephyr. And and we had that same moment, and kind of one of our early bonding experiences was discussing that exact same thing. Angelin being another old time. I've got to stop using it. I'm a veteran member.
long time, yes.
A long time member of the community. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Ren Faire History, presented by Digital Ren Faire. My name is Misti Bernard. You can find me online at bluemuseproject.com, and also my jewelry business at seasongdesigns.com. Joining me has been the inimitable Jonathan Crocker.
Yes, thank you for listening. I'm Jonathan Crocker. You can find me at wildman.com, representing the Wild Men, the Arizona Renaissance Festival, or moremud.com, which represents Theater in the Ground, performing mud shows at the Ohio Renaissance Festival. You can also find us on Facebook as Theater in the Ground and the Wild Men.